I think Elizabeth is always grateful to Catherine for the care she takes of her, but also the fact that she demonstrates to Elizabeth just how powerful a figure a woman can be.
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine. Katherine Parr was the most married queen of England's most married king. But the fact that she survived Henry VIII obscures the rest of her legacy, not least that she was the first woman to publish a book under her own name. In this Life of the Week episode, Elizabeth Norton explores how Catherine's reformist writings almost cost her her head, her true relationship with Thomas Seymour, and why her greatest legacy might be Elizabeth I. She was speaking to Kev Lochun.
Elizabeth, it's a delight to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
You're very welcome. So this episode's about Katherine Parr, and I think for listeners who are familiar with English history, she might be quite a familiar figure. But even so, would you be able to introduce us to who she is in a nutshell?
Absolutely. So Katherine Parr is famously the wife that survived Henry VIII. And of course, she's not the only one to outlive him, but in the famous rhyme, she survived. She's his sixth wife, so the final of his queens. She's an English gentlewoman, is raised to marriage by Henry VIII, to the queenship, and really embraces it. But she's very much a famous figure as an influential figure on Henry's children, and also for her involvement in the religious reform.
I wonder if we can go back to the beginning with Catherine. What do we know of her early life? And I did also wonder, who are the Parrs in the context of Tudor England at this time?
So they're quite lowly, relatively. They're a gentry family. They're not a titled family, although they do have connections to nobility. So the Parrs are a northern family. Their seat is Kendal in Cumbria, which is this sort of foreboding, ruined castle above the town. Although Catherine is unlikely ever to have actually visited the family seat, and she is born in 1512 in London, most likely. But the Parr family are landed gentry, so they're quite wealthy. Her mother is a gentlewoman, she's an heiress, so she's inherited some manors from her father. So they're a relatively wealthy family, but they are below the rank of nobility. And Catherine's parents, Sir Thomas Parr and Matilda, or Maud Green, are they're courtiers effectively. They build a court career, and so Catherine is raised around the court in London.
Do we have any sense of, in that early part of her life, anything about her character or what sort of woman she was?
Yeah, and I think with Catherine, we need to look to her mother. Her mother is such an influence on her, and really I think sets the scene for strong women in Catherine's life. Catherine's father actually dies of the plague when she's quite a small child, which leaves Catherine's mother, Maud, with 3 surviving children to bring up and try and launch on the world. And she's a real career woman. I mean, we're used to sort of thinking about gentlewomen staying at home in the period, but Maud builds her career at court. She's very close to Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, who is probably Catherine Parr's godmother. We've got the similarity of names, and I think it's quite a neat circle that the first wife is godmother to the sixth wife, most likely. She's certainly named after her. Maud is one of Catherine of Aragon's closest English friends. She is given She's given rooms at court. She's allowed to eat her meals at court, which is quite an honour in the period. She will be in and out of the household with her children. She supervises the education of her children. And actually, we know that Maud Parr runs quite a good educational establishment. We actually have a letter from another nobleman sort of saying, actually, you should raise your son with Maud Parr because, it's effectively, a school. He'll learn Latin. He'll learn to read and write, go there. So we know that she is very well educated. She may well share lessons with Princess Mary, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, as well. There's sort of some evidence that she does. It was always traditionally said that she does, but there does seem to be some evidence. So she's given a really good upbringing. We don't really see her character in this early period, and this is always a problem with people below the rank of royalty, in that they sort of come in and out in the records. But I think we can look to her mother and say, this is the woman that raises her, and she raises her to expect better in life. She wants Catherine to do something.
That's so fascinating. I hadn't realised there was courtly connection in the family and that young in Catherine's life. And certainly, from what I know of Catherine, or what I was taught of Catherine is the sixth wife of Henry VIII. but that kind of belies the fact that Henry is the third husband of Katherine Parr, and actually he's a third of four. I wonder, could you tell us a bit about... Well, let's start with her first husband.
Yeah, so Catherine is the most married Queen of England, which is quite a sort of a neat fact when she's married to the most married king. But she's married as a teenager to Edward Burr of Gainsborough. And actually, Gainsborough Old Hall still survives, where she spent some of this married life. So it's worth a visit. It's not the best marriage. It's certainly not the marriage that Catherine's mother wanted to achieve for her. And we've got a series of letters where Catherine's mother approaches Lord Dacre earlier in Catherine's childhood and tries to arrange a marriage with Lord Dacre's grandson, who's the heir to Lord Scrope. And it's sort of your classic example of the in-laws interfering. Lord Scrope is furious that his father-in-law is trying to arrange this marriage and really frustrates it. So Maud isn't able to get her first choice as husband. She does get her first choice as wife for her son William, Catherine's younger brother. She's able to marry him off to the heiress to the Earl of Essex, which is an enormous family coup, but it effectively impoverishes her. It means she spends all of the money she has to effectively buy this bride for William. So she doesn't have marriage portions for Catherine or her younger sister Anne. So Edward Burr, it's a solid match. It's not a great match. It's the best that Maud can do.
And how does that marriage go for Catherine? Because it's fairly short-lived, right?
It is. So she's married as a teenager. She lives in the household of her father-in-law, Sir Thomas Burr, who is a strong character, and I think that's sort of fair to say. He's famous as one of Anne Boleyn's officers. He actually caused a diplomatic incident when he throws the royal arms of Spain into the River Thames when he's stripping Catherine of Aragon's barge for Anne Boleyn. He's a religious reformer. This may be the moment where Catherine is first exposed to sort of early Protestantism, to the religious reform movement. He also famously will later throw one of his daughter-in-laws out of his house. Catherine's husband, on the other hand, is very much under the shadow of his father. We know very little about him. And actually, it's a very brief marriage. He dies not long after the wedding, leaving her as a childless widow in this quite difficult situation in that, the Burrs don't particularly want her there. And by this time, her mother has died. She doesn't have a home to go back to. It's hugely challenging because she doesn't have really the family support. She needs to remarry, and she needs to remarry as quickly as she can. And she actually does quite well for herself. She marries John Neville, Lord Latimer. So she actually moves up a rank. She's now a peeress in her own right. He is older than her. He's been married before. He has two children, John and Margaret, who Catherine is, of course, expected to now bring up. But it's quite a good marriage for her. I mean, it's clearly an arranged marriage. She has, she's taken this opportunity and she's run with it. But this is the first time that she'll be in charge of running her own household. And she's in charge of Snape Castle in Yorkshire. On a personal level, it seems to be quite a happy marriage. They don't have any children together, at least none that we know of. But Catherine seems to have settled into her role as stepmother. She will become very, very close to her stepdaughter, Margaret Neville. In fact, Margaret stays with her for the rest of her life. She dies as a teenager while Catherine is queen, and actually leaves a will leaving everything to the queen. John Neville, her stepson, who's quite a turbulent character, does seem to have had some relationship with her. He actually names his daughter Catherine after her, which again I think suggests that they are quite close. So on a domestic level, it seems to have been relatively happy, but it's set against huge turmoil. In October 1536, a great rebellion breaks out against Henry VIII's religious policies, and it's known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. It starts in Lincolnshire. The Lincolnshire rebels fairly quickly put down their arms, but they've lit beacons across the south side of the Humber, and within a few days Yorkshire has risen. And this is a much bigger problem to Henry, because unlike Lincolnshire, where the leaders tend to be local artisans, lower status individuals, the leader at Louth in Lincolnshire who really starts it is called Captain Cobbler, because he's a shoemaker. But in Yorkshire, their leader is Robert Aske, a one-eyed lawyer who's a very well-educated figure. But they also look to take noblemen as their captains. And one night during the early days of the rebellion, the peasants actually come to Snape Castle and they carry off Lord Latimer to become one of their captains. And it's a really fine line between duress or free will. He's certainly taken against his will, but there are indications that he does agree with what the rebels want. They want the end of the dissolution of the monasteries. They want traditional religion to be restored. They want to remove the king's reformist councillors. They very much want to sort of bring the king to heel. Lord Latimer actually is asking the Archbishop of York whether it can ever be lawful to make war against your prince, which again sort of suggests that he does sympathise with the rebels. And this really is his problem. He's carried off under duress, but how much duress really is there? Certainly Catherine's former father-in-law, Sir Thomas Burr, is able to escape the rebels when they arrive at his house in Gainsborough. Yet he rides away on his horse as fast as he can. Lord Latimer goes with them. So it's a very difficult time for Catherine. She's left alone at Snape. Eventually, the rebels do agree to go home after considerable negotiations with Henry. I mean, there may well be around 60,000 people up in arms against Henry. It's a huge rebellion. He goes home to Snape. He's then told that he needs to go to London to be a suitor for his own affairs because the king is not happy with him. So he sets out for London, and it's at that point that the Commons are not happy with him. These pilgrims who've ridden under, marched under the badge of the Five Wounds of Christ, are furious that Latimer has effectively sold them out, and they actually go and raid Snape Castle. So they take Catherine and her stepchildren hostage. They start inventorying all her goods, which means that they're planning to confiscate them, to take everything away. They may well mean considerable harm to Catherine and the children. You know, this is possibly the second most traumatic event of her life. There's more to come, but it's pretty traumatic for her. Latimer decides to turn around and come back, and he's able to defuse the Commons, luckily. But I mean, if he'd continued to London, I think Catherine may well have fared very much worse. And I think it's at this point where the couple decide they're going to move to London. And they spend the rest of their marriage before Latimer dies at the start of 1543, largely in the south.
I didn't realise there was quite so much turmoil in that period for Catherine, quite so much peril, perhaps. How does Latimer's actions in that period, he says carried away like under duress, but duress in maybe air quote marks, how is that viewed at court, and does that have any kind of repercussions for Catherine herself?
Henry is not at all happy with the rebellion, understandably, but Latimer is viewed as particularly poorly. He's actually taken to the Tower of London. He's released fairly quickly. Potentially, Catherine's able to call on some of her contacts. I think in general there's a sense that Lord Latimer has been involved, but perhaps wasn't entirely guilty. That, at least he was carried off. So there's a sense that hasn't had that much free will. I mean, actually, if you are carried off by armed commons in the period, you probably are going to do what they say. But he's certainly held under suspicion for some time, and it's damaging for Catherine. I mean, she probably doesn't agree with the Pilgrims' ideals by this stage. She probably is in favour of the dissolution of the monasteries and the changes to the church. But of course, she has to be seen to support her husband, and she's entirely tied to him. Had he been charged with treason and beheaded, as many of the leaders of the pilgrimage are, she also would have been ruined.
So her reputation's tied to Latimer, but she survives that kind of almost tarnishing. Latimer passes away. She's left a widow again. How does she navigate that period between being the widow of a peer held in suspicion to suddenly becoming Queen of England?
So Catherine, again, going back to her parents, she has the court contacts to survive this. And she's able to call upon Princess Mary. Whenever Henry doesn't have a queen, and he doesn't have a queen in this period, he's beheaded Catherine Howard in February 1542. And unsurprisingly, few women have been that keen to really put their hat in the ring, if you like, to become his sixth wife. So whenever he doesn't have a queen, he tends to bring Mary to court, because it's the queen that supplies the women to court. If you've got a bachelor king and no woman at court, you don't really have any women at court. So Mary comes to effectively take the role as queen. She's an adult by that stage. So all of the ladies at court are with Mary. She plays the role as queen, and Catherine starts to call on Mary, and we can see that in the records. And it's around that time actually that it's noted that Henry starts to call on Mary a lot more regularly than he usually does, which he's not the most hands-on of fathers, so it does cause some comment. So it's really through Mary, I think, that Catherine comes to Henry's attention. He's probably known her for most of her life, But of course, this is one moment where she's sort of free and he's free. And he clearly quite quickly, possibly even before Lord Latimer's death, starts to look at her as a potential sixth bride.
And, would that marriage, when it comes, would that have raised eyebrows?
She's certainly not someone you would ordinarily consider to be royal wife material. She's also, of course, a widow, so she's not a young virgin. However, he tried to marry a young virgin before with Catherine Howard, and that obviously turned out to be a disaster. And I think actually part of Catherine's attraction to Henry is the fact that she's a widow. He's actually passed a law following Catherine Howard's fall that it's illegal for a non-virgin to marry the king without sort of disclosing the fact that they've got a past. Of course, she's a widow. He can't expect her to be a virgin. No one could reasonably expect her to be a virgin, and so that kind of doesn't apply to her. So widows are really the market that Henry is sort of looking in.
Not a sentence I expected to hear. I'd wonder if at this point we could just touch on Thomas Seymour very quickly and who he is, because he is a figure who plays a big part in Catherine's life later, but also I believe they're already acquainted now.
They are. So Thomas Seymour is the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. So he is Henry VIII's brother-in-law. He also comes from a relatively lowly background. The Seymours actually are, they're country gentry. They're very sort of minor figures. But the fact that Jane dies giving birth to Edward VI, the future Edward VI, really pushes them up. So the Seymour brothers, Edward and Thomas, remain very prominent at court. And he's probably broadly Catherine's age, a few years older, but quite similar. And they have quite similar interests. They're both interested in the religious reform. Catherine perhaps a bit more sort of heartfelt than Thomas. But they're sort of natural people that would come together to some extent. They're both very good looking. Thomas Seymour is renowned for being one of the handsomest men at court. He's the most eligible bachelor at Henry's court. Catherine is a very attractive woman, and I think this doesn't get pulled out enough, really, when particularly earlier myths about her as sort of this blue stocking that marries the king. From her portrait, she's very, very attractive. So they clearly know each other. Catherine will later write that she wanted to marry Thomas Seymour the last time she was free, and she writes this to Thomas. And of course, the last time she was free was before she married Henry VIII. So it appears that the two are in a relationship, and it's often been asserted that she's a rich widow and he's being quite predatory. He's trying to marry her for her money, but I think that doesn't really stack up. She's not that rich. Lord Latimer hasn't left her that much cash. He can do better. The Duke of Norfolk was considering marrying his daughter to Thomas Seymour at one point, for example. He can certainly make a better match than Catherine. So the fact that they are involved in each other, I think we can see that there is probably love or attraction on both sides. And that is the complicated thing with Catherine's relationship with Thomas. There is undoubted desire on both sides, but obviously we'll talk about it later, but it does not necessarily turn out as well as they would have hoped. But she does seem to have involved herself with Thomas Seymour at this point, and so is somewhat horrified when Henry VIII really plays his hand.
And just to clarify something you said there about Lord Latimer kind of left her some money, but she's not mega rich. Did she need to marry at this point in the same way she did after her first marriage?
Yeah, no, she definitely doesn't need to marry. She's wealthy enough to live for the rest of her life. She's got life interests in some of Lord Latimer's estates. She's got money. She's got the court connections as well. This is not the same as after the end of her first marriage, where she's somewhat in dire straits. This time she could comfortably live as a widow. Catherine definitely doesn't need to make a third marriage. So again, the fact that the king is interested isn't necessarily something she's looking for.
And yet here he is. Something you mentioned very briefly there was Thomas Seymour and Katherine Parr being about the same age, and it made me realise we haven't actually talked about where she is in her life. So she's just married Henry. What age is she at that point, and what age is he?
So Catherine marries Henry VIII in July 1543. She's been quite reluctant. It was later said that she'd rather be his mistress. That she says she'd rather be his mistress than his wife, and he thinks she's just being sort of coy. Whether that's contemporary or not, I think is debatable. But there's certainly, there's a contemporary poem that Henry has sort of scrawled in a prayer book that sort of suggests he's pushing quite hard to marry this attractive young widow, and she is young. And this quite often gets overlooked. She's 30 when she marries. She's almost 31 when she marries Henry VIII in July 1543. So she is a youthful figure. She's young, she's attractive. She's also a woman potentially who could bear children. And actually this is why, to some extent, the choice of her is quite odd by Henry. He's only got one surviving son. illegitimize his two daughters. So actually only Edward is in the line of succession, and he really could do with a few more baby boys sort of shoring up the Tudor royal nursery. And choosing Catherine, who doesn't seem to have borne any children, is quite an odd choice. And it does again suggest that actually he's very attracted to her. He is very much looking for a wife in the fullest sense of the word, something which I think also may have been fairly horrifying for Catherine. She'll later write that God withstood her will at the time and sort of effectively persuaded her by God's silence that she should become queen. So again, she's not the most willing of brides. She clearly doesn't want to marry Henry VIII.
And what do we know about her relationship with Henry? Because I think there's a kind of like a popular perception that by this point, Henry's quite corpuscular and she's a bit of a nursemaid to him. And I just wonder, how true to life is that?
I mean, it's not really. Henry VIII has plenty of doctors and, attendants to deal with his leg wound. He is not in his prime by this stage by any means. He's got an open ulcer on his leg that he's had for some years, which cannot have been very pleasant to be around. I imagine it also affected his mood to a considerable extent because, of course, it would have been very, very painful. He's rapidly gained weight. He's not very mobile. Towards the end of his reign, he'll need to be winched onto his horse and sort of winched up the stairs. He's only in his 50s, but actually he's not looked after himself. But he doesn't need Catherine to be his nurse. He doesn't need to marry his nurse. So again, it's a bit of a Victorian myth that we have her sort of soothing his leg in her lap and sort of bandaging it. Actually, he is expecting a physical marriage. Whether he is able to achieve that or not, there have been rumours about Henry's virility since his marriage to Anne Boleyn, but certainly he's attracted to Catherine. He's hoping that she'll be his wife in the fullest sense of the word, and perhaps they'll have children.
So also during the period of marriage, and this is a word you've mentioned a couple of times, is Catherine writes of things later on. And, one side to it that we haven't discussed yet is that actually she is an author. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about that side of her.
Yeah, so absolutely. So Catherine is a very reluctant queen. But when she becomes queen, she embraces it and she embraces the opportunities that this affords her. And one of this is in her writing. She is the first English woman to publish a book under her own name, which I think is an achievement that really should be shouted from the rooftops. It's perhaps not as widely known as it should be. She publishes in 1545 her Prayers or Meditations, which is a religious work. It's a collection of it says exactly what it is. It's a collection of prayers and meditations. She must have achieved Henry's permission to publish it, which means that it is not as radical as I suspect she wanted to be. It's quite conventional in its tone. You really have to sort of read between the lines to spot any reformist faith in prayers or meditations. She doesn't make any appeals to the saints, and that's quite interesting because, of course, traditional religion, you very much would appeal to the saints. So the fact that they're omitted, I think we can see reformist beliefs. But she has to be very careful. Henry VIII is actually quite proud of the fact that she's written this book, certainly allows her to publish it. Catherine purchases presentation copies for her relatives and her friends. And, Henry VIII, of course, owns a copy. In fact, his daughter Elizabeth will later translate the book into several languages and present it to Henry as a New Year's gift. So he clearly approves of this book. And it's interesting in itself because it shows this woman writing this book for herself. She's thinking about religion. But it's certainly not her most radical of works, and she will save that to be published after Henry's death. But we know that she must have been writing this book during his lifetime. It's her Lamentation of a Sinner, which is her most famous work. And this is overtly Protestant. If we didn't think she was a Protestant by this stage, she's certainly a Protestant when she's writing Lamentation of a Sinner. It's very inwardly reflective. She talks about her conversion experience, and in quite a broad term. I'd like to know more details from her, but in quite broad terms, she speaks about her conversion, how the personal relationship she has with God, and she sort of abases herself. She calls herself a sinner. She's not worthy. She also talks about the fact that she would give up everything she has, all her jewels, her dresses, to bring one person over to the true church. I suspect she wouldn't, in that Catherine loves her clothing. Her accounts are full of very rich fabrics, but again, it demonstrates just how inwardly her piety is. She's clearly really, really thinking about religion, and she wants to convert people. She wants to tell her story. It's an evangelical text. She must have written this during Henry VIII's reign, or substantially so, because it's published not long after his death, but it's certainly not a book that he would ever give permission for her to publish. And actually, it's quite dangerous that she had the manuscript at all during his lifetime.
What was the reaction to that book being released?
Lamentation is released in the reign of Edward VI, when we get the proper Protestant Reformation in England. Henry has, of course, broken with Rome. He's made some changes to the traditional church, particularly publishing the Bible in English, although he does backtrack. Actually, during his marriage to Catherine, he passes a law that makes it illegal for women to read the Bible in English, for example, and lower status men. So he does backtrack. But under Edward VI, thanks to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and also Edward Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, the Protestant Reformation really gets going. The churches are whitewashed, the bells are removed, the altars are taken out. You have to have a communion table in the centre of the church. So actually, in that context, Catherine's book is very much seen as an achievement. The circles she moves in, people are interested in it. It's seen as, sort of one of the monuments of the religious reform. It's less clear how widely read it would be among the general population. And certainly at that stage, most of Edward's subjects probably aren't Protestant, although London and Norwich, the two major cities, are absolutely full of Protestants by this stage, as are the universities. But it is seen as an interesting statement, a remarkable statement of feminine piety. And obviously, as a woman in the Tudor period, women are always second-class citizens in the Tudor period. People listen less to the words of women, but it is seen as a remarkable achievement. And I think Lamentation of a Sinner is the achievement that Catherine would want to be remembered for.
So obviously, it's not a book that Henry himself would have condoned. And it wasn't published in his lifetime, but as I understand it, there was some part of her, kind of like her writing, that did draw some ire from Henry.
Yes. So, again, she's famously the wife that survived Henry, but I think had he lived much longer, it's possible that she wouldn't be. And the marriage does get into trouble based on her religious beliefs. So Henry is very, very far from being a Protestant. He's not really a Catholic either, but he's closer to Catholicism. He's more of a schismatic than a heretic, as far as people of the time would view it. Catherine seems to have viewed her queenship as God's will. When she says God withstood my will, she seems to think she has a higher purpose, and it may be that she thinks that's to convert Henry VIII. And there's an account written not long after Catherine's death that talks about, she got into the habit of debating with him while he was ill in bed, and she'd be challenging his religious beliefs. And one day she leaves the room and he turns to the people with him and says, massively paraphrasing, but sort of complains, that he's being taught by his wife in his old age and how women have become such doctresses. Stephen Gardiner, Risley, the Lord Chancellor, use this as a way to try to bring Catherine down. They persuade Henry to draw up an arrest warrant for her for heresy. She almost certainly is guilty of heresy. She's been probably involved with Anne Askew, who is a Lincolnshire woman who is thrown out of her house and then goes south preaching the gospel. And she's been arrested and actually tortured in the Tower of London by the Lord Chancellor, who actually turns the rack himself to try to get information on her connections with Catherine and some of the ladies of court. She doesn't give much away, but there's a clear connection with Catherine and her household. And Anne's actually then burned at the stake. So there's clearly movements against Catherine. It's a very odd plot against Catherine. The arrest warrant is drawn up, but it's then dropped outside the door of her chambers. So it's, of course, brought to her. Earlier in the day, Henry has actually confessed what's happening to his doctor, Dr. Wendy. But then Catherine becomes hysterical when she reads this document, as you can imagine. Henry has, of course, beheaded 2 queens before her. Henry hears her crying and says, "Oh, Dr. Wendy, I think the Queen's ill. Would you mind going to see her to see if she's okay?" So Dr. Wendy, of course, goes to Catherine and goes, "Okay, this is what's happening. You need to go to the king and persuade him that you're not a heretic and that you haven't been trying to convert him to Protestantism." So Catherine composes herself, goes to the king, and the king immediately tries to draw her into a religious debate. So he says, there's a point of doctrine that I need you to clear up for me, Catherine. What do you think it is? And she immediately goes in sort of full little wife mode. She says, well, I just couldn't possibly teach your majesty. I'm just a woman. And Henry goes, well, look, of course you can. You've been debating me for ages. And I mean, again, I'm massively paraphrasing here. And she says, oh, if I have debated with you, it's only to try to soothe your pain and your sickness, to take your mind off your sickness, and also potentially to learn from you. So, again, she really sort of debases herself before her husband. And he says, well, in that case, we are true friends again. He doesn't tell Risley that he's made up with Catherine, and he and Catherine are then walking in the gardens the next day, and Risley arrives with some soldiers to arrest her. Henry then starts kicking Risley and calling him a knave, and Catherine very sweetly tries to intercede for Risley, saying, well, I don't know how he's offended you, but please don't do that. Only for Henry to say, if you knew what he'd done, you wouldn't say that. So it's such a weird incident. And I think we can't take it fully at face value. I mean, if Henry had wanted to execute Catherine, he very easily could have done. It looks very much like a test for her, or attempt to put her back into her place, to get her to stop debating about religion, to stop being so openly Protestant. And I think that probably is the purpose of it. He doesn't want to replace her, but he's not happy with her. And actually, for the rest of the reign, this happens in 1546, not only a few months before Henry dies. And actually, the relationship between them doesn't seem to be particularly good for the final months of his reign. Certainly, she's excluded from his deathbed. She's sent away. And actually, I found some records demonstrating that December she does attempt to go to the king at Westminster. He's at Whitehall Palace. She actually loads everything into her barges and tries to get in to see him, and is turned away. So the relationship clearly isn't that good between them. And I think potentially, had Henry lived longer and had better health, he may well have considered replacing her. I suspect it's simply in 1546 he doesn't have another candidate in mind.
There's mistrust. Maybe Henry replaced her had he lived longer, or he'd had another candidate, but he didn't. He passes away. So what happens to Catherine now that she's a widow a third time?
So Catherine is not with Henry when he died, and he's very much cloistered away with his council, particularly his secretary, Sir William Paget, who he's quite close to. He changes his will in December, and there are some doubts over the validity of the will. It may or may not have been signed with a stamp of his signature rather than the king's own hand, but it does seem to have represented what he wanted. And instead of leaving Catherine as regent, he doesn't in fact appoint a regent. He creates a council of 16 equal-ranking executors to his will who are going to rule England during Edward's minority, because Edward is, of course, only 9 years old. It's probably unworkable. There's no head to this council. So he's expecting these 16 quite diverse individuals to work together. But what's very telling is Catherine is entirely excluded. He no longer wants her to be involved in the governance of England. Catherine probably doesn't know about this will. The problem for Catherine is that she isn't Edward's mother at the end of the day. She's been a loving stepmother to him. She's raised him during the years of her marriage. He calls her his good mother, but of course she isn't his mother. And so his uncle Edward Seymour, as Duke of Somerset, is able to overturn the will and have himself appointed as Lord Protector. So Catherine is very firmly out. She's excluded from power. She's even excluded from the presence of Edward, her young stepson. She's not even allowed to see him. She's expected to do what disenfranchised dowager queens do, and that's go to the countryside and sort of stay there, really.
Catherine's left beyond power, it seems. Does she go to the country?
So she doesn't go to the country, and she's not the only person excluded from power. So Catherine retires to her dower houses, Chelsea and Hamworth, mainly in Chelsea in this period, which isn't that far from the centre of power, of course. Her former suitor, Thomas Seymour, who is the king's younger uncle, is also excluded from power. He's sort of paid off, if you like. He's given the title of Baron Seymour of Sudeley, and he's created Lord High Admiral of England, although he's not actually very good at sailing. But he's also not given any power. He wants to share power. He tries to find precedents to show that if the king has two uncles, then they should share the role. One should be Lord Protector and one should be governor of the king. He wants to take control of the king, but he's very much pushed out of power. So we have these two disenfranchised individuals, Catherine and Thomas, and both are highly aggrieved at the way the regency has fallen. And so they sort of naturally gravitate towards each other in this period.
And you alluded to they'd had this kind of love match almost early on, but it didn't quite work out how they hoped it would. Can we talk a bit about that story now?
Yeah, so what we know about the relationship between Thomas and Catherine in 1543 comes through Catherine's letters to Thomas in 1547. And she mentions that she would have married him last time she was free. And there is evidence that Henry sort of tried to get him out the way, to clear the field. Thomas is sent off to be an ambassador, for example. There's no scandal between them during Catherine's reign. So they're clearly staying far enough apart that no one is sort of suggesting that they may be having an affair, and they're not, as far as we can tell. But they do become reacquainted quite quickly. There is some evidence that Thomas Seymour is not initially that keen to return to Katherine Parr. He's looking at first for a royal bride. There's evidence that he asks his brother if he can marry Princess Mary, and his brother, the protector, says, we are not married, we are not born to marry princesses. And then he says, actually, and anyway, I know she wouldn't accept you. And actually, that's true. I think Princess Mary would not have accepted Thomas Seymour. There's also some evidence that he then turns towards the younger princess, Princess Elizabeth, who's actually only 13 years old. There's a somewhat dubious letter that sort of suggests that he proposes marriage to her. Whether or not that's true is difficult to say, although Elizabeth's governess, Kate Ashley, will later refer to Thomas as her old suitor, which suggests there may have been something between the pair of them. If he does propose to Elizabeth, she turns him down, and he then turns back to Katherine Parr because she's sort of the next best royal match that he can hope for. And they do have this previous relationship. Catherine is clearly very passionate about Thomas, and we can see it in the letters. And as far as we can tell, he's in love with her, but not in a disinterested way. So at this stage in his career, he wouldn't have married her if she wasn't the queen. So, there is attraction there, but he's also looking to increase his position. And I think that's something that Catherine hasn't recognised. She's been married 3 times before, but they've all been arranged marriages. This is her first attempt to choose for herself, and she's perhaps not very good at it. She marries Thomas Seymour in secret very soon after Henry VIII's death. We don't know exactly when, but it was later said that it was so soon that had she conceived a child, the succession would have been in jeopardy because they couldn't have proved whose child it was. Could have been Henry VIII's, could have been Thomas Seymour's. So they clearly get married quite early. And they then need to attempt to publicise the marriage because actually, they haven't got permission from the king. They should have got permission from the king. Protector Somerset refuses his permission. In fact, his wife really hates Katherine Parr. She tries to take precedence over her in this period. They sort of fight as they go through doorways to get through the door first. She's also reported to have said that she's not giving way to Katherine Parr because Henry VIII only married her in his dotage anyway. So it's all very tense. Catherine actually later writes a letter where she says that if she'd been standing closer to the Lord Protector, she would have bitten him. She was so angry. So Thomas instead decides, let's go to the king. Let's ask the king for permission. So he's able to. He has a friend in the king's household who he's able to persuade to speak to Edward on his behalf. And he first of all says, who do you think that your uncle Thomas Seymour should marry? And Edward goes, my sister Mary, to change her opinions, because of course she's a Catholic. And then he says, no, actually Anne of Cleves, who's Henry VIII's 4th wife, who's still very much alive. And it's only really further pushing with Thomas sort of sending messages saying, don't you think it would be a good idea for Thomas to marry Katherine Parr, that the king is persuaded. But they make it sound to Edward as though it's his idea. So he fully supports the marriage. He's only 9 years old, but he's still the king. And so Protector Somerset can't go against Edward if he supports the marriage. So it's able to be publicised. But it is another blow to the relationship between the Thomas and Catherine and Edward Seymour and his wife. The two brothers' relationship is never healed from this point.
Does that have any particular repercussions for Catherine herself?
It does. It very firmly puts her on the party that is hostile to the Protector, which I think he knew she would be anyway. On a personal level, the Protector confiscates her jewellery. It's been stored in the Tower of London for safekeeping, but he won't give it back. It's clearly quite vindictive to hold on to some of these jewels or all of these jewels, and it will be a point of contention for the rest of her life. She remains excluded from power. She's still not really able to see Edward or to correspond to any great extent to Edward. Princess Mary is furious when she hears about the marriage, and actually the two do fall out for some time. And it's really only with Elizabeth that Catherine remains on good terms of her royal stepchildren.
And I wonder if we could dwell a little bit on the relationship between Catherine and the Princess of Elizabeth. You alluded to it earlier, the way that Thomas Seymour perhaps approaches her.
Yeah, so Elizabeth is 13 years old, so she's a bit young to be sort of out by herself in her own household. So she lives with Catherine, which it seems natural enough. Catherine's her stepmother, she's raised her. The two are very, very close. Catherine probably doesn't know about Thomas's proposal to her stepdaughter. I think it would be unlikely that she would bring them both together if she did. Thomas Seymour, however, is quite quickly quite inappropriate towards Elizabeth, and of course it's quite well known today. He starts by sort of coming into her bedchamber early in the morning and trying to climb into the bed and sort of tickling her. He will come bare-legged and in his slippers, according to one account. He's very inappropriate with Elizabeth. And there are some incidents where Catherine is involved. So she sometimes joins in the early morning, sort of trying to get into the bed and tickling. There's another incident where Elizabeth is in the gardens of Hanworth, which is one of Catherine's dower houses, and Catherine actually holds her while Thomas Seymour slashes her dress to pieces. So with his dagger. So it's Catherine is involved. I think it's difficult to reconcile with this image of this religious and devoted queen. And I think the way to do it is we have to look at the status of women in the period. Married women, even queens, have no independent legal status. So everything Catherine owns belongs to Thomas Seymour. She's not an independent figure when she's married to Thomas. He's also head of her household. So he's effectively Elizabeth's stepfather. He's in charge. You can't lock doors against Thomas. He owns the household. And I think he's quite an abusive husband. And we can see this in some of the accounts. He clearly takes all of her money into his own hands. He has her officers pay her revenues over to him. There's also an account that he's an oppressor in the household, and that comes from Elizabeth's servants, which is sort of an interesting choice of word. There's another account where Catherine is in a room by herself when a male groom comes in to tend the fire. And while he's in the room, the door shuts. And when Thomas hears that she's been in a room with a man by herself, he's absolutely furious and flies into a rage. So my reading of it is actually that, it's quite difficult for her to take action against Thomas. He is in charge of her. He can do what he likes with her and her household. And perhaps actually involving herself, at least it does chaperone Elizabeth to some extent. He's not likely to do anything too awful to Elizabeth while she's there. She doesn't come out of the Elizabeth and Thomas situation very well, but I think in the period that probably is the best she can manage.
It's definitely a darker episode, it seems. And it does occur quite towards the end of her life. I'm pretty sure she doesn't live for very long afterwards, but I wonder what of Catherine's own passing.
Catherine shocks everyone, probably mostly her, by falling pregnant towards the end of 1547. As far as we know, she's never had a previous pregnancy. She may have done, and it hasn't been recorded, but she certainly hasn't had a surviving child. And she is deliriously happy. We have letters written to her, to Thomas, talking about feeling the baby kick. She has a maid lie in her bed with her and they both feel the baby move. They talk about their little knave. They're clear it's going to be a boy. And they talk about how he's going to revenge them against the protector later on. So they're still dwelling on the fact they've been excluded from power. But she's clearly very excited. She talks about her diet and her exercise because she wants this pregnancy to be healthy because, of course, she's an older mother for the period. She's in her late 30s by this stage, and every pregnancy is dangerous in Tudor England. Not long before the household moved to Sudeley Castle, they decide to go there because it is Thomas's baronial seat. She actually seems to have come upon Elizabeth and Thomas embracing and sends Elizabeth away. So Elizabeth isn't with them when they go to Sudeley. She spends the summer preparing for the birth. and at the end of August 1548, she gives birth to a daughter. So she doesn't have the little knave she was hoping for. In fact, Protector Somerset writes a letter to Thomas congratulating him, but saying, I'm a bit disappointed it was a girl and not a boy, and I'm sure you are too. But, it's an apparently healthy baby. They name her Mary after Princess Mary, who Catherine has been reconciled to. But unfortunately for Catherine, and it's very, very common in the period, she falls ill very shortly after the birth, childbed fever or puerperal fever. Doctors in the period don't wash their hands. They don't understand hygiene. It's very, very common. Jane Seymour, of course, has died in childbirth. Henry VIII's mother, Elizabeth of York, has also died in childbirth. A lot of women do. She spends some time quite delirious by all accounts. There are accounts of her criticising Thomas on her deathbed, saying that she's had many shrewd taunts directed at her, saying that he wishes her ill. So it's not a comfortable or a good death, really, for Catherine. I think that's very tragic. She doesn't go peacefully. She dies at the beginning of September 1548 at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a place that she doesn't have that much connection to. So she also dies quite far away from home. So it's quite a sad end.
We started by saying Katherine Parr is the most married Tudor queen. Can you leave our listeners with a sense of how we should remember Parr today? Yes,
so of course she's the most married Tudor queen. But I think what we should remember her for are absolutely her achievements. And I think, it's... I always sets my teeth on edge when people talk about feminists in the 16th century, because of course there's no feminism. They all come from a context that women are inferior to men. That's the life they've been brought up in. That's what they know. But I think she does set the path of women moving, and she does demonstrate that a woman can be an author, that a woman can be a powerful figure. I think her abiding legacy is undoubtedly Elizabeth I. She's not Elizabeth's mother. Her mother is Anne Boleyn. She's not the woman that carries out her daily care. That's Kate Ashley or Blanche Parry. But Catherine is the woman who really sort of takes Elizabeth on. She didn't have to do it. And I think Elizabeth is always grateful to Catherine for the care she takes of her, but also the fact that she demonstrates to Elizabeth just how powerful a figure a woman can be. And I think when we see the queenship of Elizabeth I, I think we look back and we can see echoes of Catherine. And I think that's her legacy.